Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul, Marcus Aurelius. Meditations, Book 4. Marcus Aurelius wrote those words nearly 2,000 years ago. He wrote them for you.
There was a man who controlled an empire and still could not control the people closest to him. Marcus Aurelius sat alone in his tent on the edge of the Danube, surrounded by generals who flattered him to his face and undermined him the moment he turned away. He knew what it felt like to be manipulated by someone skilled enough to make their cruelty look like love. He wrote about it in the dark, not to complain, but to understand. Chapter 1. Marcus Aurelius kept a private weapon that he never spoke of in public, and he wrote about it only for himself, never expecting the world to read it. He called it the discipline of perception, and it began with a single devastating realization. The people around him who wounded him with their manipulation were not actually wounding him directly. They were wounding the story he told himself about their actions. Think about what happens when a narcissist criticizes you unfairly.
And what he discovered nearly 2,000 years ago is the exact weapon you are about to learn tonight. You have met someone like this. Perhaps you are related to them. Perhaps you married them. Perhaps you work beside them every single day. They twist your words until you no longer trust your own memory. They punish you with silence, then accuse you of causing the silence. They take credit for your effort and blame you for their failure. And the strangest part is this.
The words leave their mouth, travel through the air, and arrive at your ears. At that exact moment, before any pain occurs, your mind makes a decision. It decides what those words mean. It decides whether they are true. It decides how much power to give them. The narcissist supplies the words, but you supply the meaning. And if you supply the meaning, you also hold the power to withhold it. This is the first Stoic method, and it is called separating the event from the interpretation.
The more you try to explain yourself to them, the more power you hand them. This is not a coincidence. This is the architecture of narcissistic control, and it has existed since the beginning of human relationships. The philosophers of Stoicism did not have the clinical word for it, but they understood its mechanics with frightening precision.
Marcus Aurelius wrote that it is not the thing itself that disturbs a man, but his judgment about the thing. A narcissist can throw insults, accusations, guilt, and manipulation at you all day. But until your mind agrees to interpret those actions as a verdict on your worth, they remain nothing more than noise, sound without weight, words without authority.
Epictetus lived as a slave under a master who beat him without warning, and from that suffering he extracted a truth that therapists would not formalize for another 18 centuries. Seneca served an emperor who would eventually order his death, and he learned to navigate that danger without losing his own mind. These were not theoretical philosophers writing in comfort.
This sounds simple in theory, and feels nearly impossible in practice because narcissists are skilled at attacking your interpretation directly. They do not simply insult you. They insult you, and then demand that you accept their insult as truth. They create scenes designed to make their judgment of you feel inevitable, almost factual. This is why the discipline must be practiced deliberately, almost like a muscle, until it becomes instinct. Here is how Marcus Aurelius applied it.
These were men who faced manipulation, cruelty, and psychological warfare in its hostess form, and they built a discipline strong enough to survive it. What you are about to receive are 5 methods drawn directly from their writings, refined for the specific architecture of the modern narcissist. These are not techniques of confrontation. You will not be taught to argue, to expose, or to retaliate.
When someone in his court spoke against him, betrayed his trust, or manipulated his decisions for their own gain, he would mentally pause before reacting. He would ask himself a single question. What did this person actually do? Stripped of my emotional story about it. Not what does this mean about me? Not what does this reveal about my worth? Simply, what happened? A man spoke certain words. A man took a certain action. That is the event.
The Stoics understood something that most people only discover after years of exhausting conflict. A narcissist does not fear your anger. Your anger is fuel to them. What a narcissist truly fears is your indifference, because indifference is the one reaction they cannot manipulate. Each method you are about to learn operates silently. No confrontation, no raised voice, no explanation given to someone who was never going to listen honestly in the first place.
Everything else, the humiliation, the anger, the self-doubt, is something the mind constructs afterward. Once you separate the event from the story, something remarkable happens. The narcissist's behavior becomes information rather than injury. You begin to see their manipulation as a pattern to study, not a verdict to absorb. You notice the technique instead of feeling the wound.
Just a quiet internal shift that strips them of the only thing they have ever wanted from you, which is control over your reactions. Stay until the final method. It is the one the Stoics consider the most difficult to master, and the one that creates a transformation so complete that the narcissist will sense it before they can name it. Let us begin where Marcus Aurelius began, in the quiet architecture of his own mind.
And the moment you study someone instead of suffering under them, you have already taken back a piece of power they assumed was permanently theirs. This is why narcissists often grow more aggressive when their usual tactics stop working. They sense, even if they cannot articulate it, that you are no longer supplying the meaning they need. Your silence is not absence. Your calm is not weakness. It is the architecture of a mind that has stopped handing over its interpretation for free. But knowing this principle is only the beginning. The next method goes further, into territory that feels almost unnatural at first, because it requires you to stop doing something that every instinct in your body will tell you to do. Chapter 2. Epictetus spent the early years of his life as a slave, owned by a man named Epictetus who was known for his cruelty. There is a story told by ancient historians that his master once twisted his leg as a form of punishment or amusement. Epictetus is said to have calmly warned him that if he continued, the leg would break. His master continued anyway. The leg broke. Epictetus is reported to have responded without anger, simply observing that he had told him this would happen. No scream, no plea, no emotional collapse for his master to feed on. This story, whether embellished by history or not, reveals the second method, and it is perhaps the most difficult one to practice because it goes against every social instinct you have been taught since childhood. The method is this: stop explaining yourself to people who are not listening to understand you. They are listening to find ammunition. When a narcissist accuses you of something, your natural response is to defend yourself. You want to explain your intentions, clarify the misunderstanding, prove that their version of events is wrong. This feels like the responsible thing to do. It feels like honesty. But Epictetus would tell you that you are walking directly into a trap, because a narcissist does not actually want clarity. They want engagement. Every explanation you offer becomes new material for them to twist, reframe, and use against you later. Epictetus taught that some things are within our control, and some things are not. Your intentions are within your control. Their perception of your intentions is not. You can explain yourself perfectly, with complete honesty and total transparency, and a narcissist will still choose to misinterpret you, because misinterpretation serves their need for control. This means that explaining yourself to them is not actually about achieving understanding. It is about you trying to manage something that was never yours to manage in the first place, which is another person's willingness to see you fairly. The moment you stop explaining, something shifts in the dynamic. The narcissist is accustomed to a back and forth, a push and pull where your defense gives them new angles to attack. When you remove that defense entirely, when you simply allow their accusation to exist in the air without feeding it, they lose their primary tool. They are left holding an accusation that has nowhere to go, because the audience they needed, which was your emotional reaction, has gone silent. This does not mean you become passive or allow lies to stand uncontested in every context. It means you stop performing your innocence for someone whose goal was never to discover the truth. There is a difference between defending your character to people who matter and exhausting yourself trying to win the approval of someone who has already decided to misunderstand you. Epictetus lived this principle daily, as a man with no legal power over his own body, and still found a freedom that his master, despite owning him, never possessed. If a man in chains can refuse to hand over his peace of mind, you, with considerably more freedom than he ever had, can certainly learn to stop negotiating your worth with someone who was never bargaining in good faith. The next method moves from what you stop doing to what you start doing instead, and it involves a Stoic practice so counterintuitive that most people resist it the first time they hear it. Chapter 3. Seneca wrote a letter to his friend Lucilius describing a technique that sounds almost paradoxical at first. He suggested imagining the worst possible outcome before it happens, not to create anxiety, but to dissolve it. He called this practice the premeditation of adversity, and it forms the foundation of the third method, which is learning to expect the narcissist's behavior so completely that it loses its power to wound you. Most people are devastated by narcissistic behavior not because the behavior itself is so extraordinary, but because they keep expecting something different. They keep hoping that this time will be the exception. This time the apology will be genuine. This time the promise will be kept. This time the person will finally see them clearly and treat them with the respect they deserve. And when that hope is betrayed again, as it almost always is, the pain feels fresh every single time, as if it were the first betrayal rather than the 40th. Seneca would tell you that this repeated devastation comes from refusing to see the pattern for what it is. He wrote to Lucilius that nothing ought to be unexpected by us, that our minds should range ahead into every situation and consider what may happen, not only what usually does. Applied to a narcissist, this means studying their pattern with the detachment of a scientist, rather than the hope of a hopeful partner, friend, or child. If someone has shown you through repeated and consistent behavior that they manipulate, deflect, and deny, then their next manipulation should never arrive as a shock. It should arrive as confirmation. This is not pessimism. Seneca was careful to distinguish premeditation from despair. The purpose is not to assume the worst about all people in all situations, draining your capacity for trust and connection. The purpose is to stop being repeatedly blindsided by one specific person who has already revealed exactly who they are. When you mentally rehearse their likely behavior in advance, accepting it as probable rather than hoping it as impossible, the actual event, when it arrives, lands with far less force. You expected the storm. You are already wearing the coat. There's a strange kind of freedom in this. Once you stop hoping a narcissist will suddenly transform into someone they have never been, you stop handing them the power to disappoint you. Disappointment requires expectation, and expectation requires belief in a future that the evidence does not support. Seneca, who served under an emperor capable of ordering his death at any moment, could not afford the luxury of false hope about that man's character. He prepared his mind daily for cruelty so that cruelty, when it arrived, could not destabilize him. This method also changes how you respond in real time. A person who is shocked reacts emotionally, often saying things they regret, escalating a conflict that the narcissist can then use as evidence against them. A person who expected this exact moment responds with composure because nothing has actually surprised them. They feel the sting, because Stoicism never asked you to stop feeling, but they do not collapse under it, because they had already, mentally, walked through this exact scenario before it occurred. The fourth method builds directly on this foundation, and it concerns something the Stoics valued above almost everything else, a resource that every narcissist desperately wants from you, and that you have likely been giving away without realizing it. Chapter 4. There is a resource more valuable to a narcissist than your love, your loyalty, or even your obedience, and that resource is your attention. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about guarding the mind as if it were a fortress, because he understood something that modern psychology would later confirm in clinical terms. Whoever controls your attention controls your inner life. A narcissist instinctively understands this too, even without the philosophical language to explain it, which is why their behavior so often escalates the moment you try to disengage. This fourth method is the discipline of attention as territory. Imagine your mind as a piece of land that only you are meant to govern. Every time you replay an argument with a narcissist in your head long after it has ended, you have handed them a portion of that land, rent-free, and they are not even present to know they are occupying it. Every time you rehearse the perfect comeback you wish you had said, draft the text message proving your point, or lie awake constructing the conversation where they finally admit they were wrong, You are not punishing them. You are imprisoning yourself with their image, using your own mental energy as the chains. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Yet he wrote that a man can find a quiet retreat from all the troubled clamor in his own soul, simply by entering it. He believed the mind could become an inner citadel, a place no external chaos could breach unless you yourself opened the gate. Applied to narcissistic manipulation, this means recognizing that the narcissist's behavior happened once, in a single moment, but your mind has the power to either end that moment or replay it 1,000 times. If you replay it, you become the author of your own continued suffering, using their original cruelty as raw material. This is not the same as suppression. The Stoics did not teach you to bury pain or pretend it does not exist. They taught you to notice when your attention has wandered into territory that no longer serves you, and to consciously walk it back, the same way you would notice your foot stepping into mud and choose to step out rather than continue forward. The practice is simple to describe and difficult to master. The instant you catch your mind replaying the narcissist's words, you name it. You say internally, this is rehearsal, not reality, and you redirect your attention towards something within your actual control, your work, your breath, the person currently in front of you who deserves your presence. Narcissists often escalate their behavior when they sense your attention drifting away from them, because their identity depends on remaining the center of someone's emotional world. The less mental real estate you grant them, the more unstable their tactics become, because the tactics were never designed to function in a vacuum. They require an audience replaying the performance long after the curtain falls. Refuse to be that audience in your own mind, and the performance loses its purpose. Guarding your attention this way is perhaps the most physically invisible of all the methods, because no one watching you would know it is happening. There is no confrontation to witness, no dramatic boundary being drawn in front of others. It happens entirely within the fortress Marcus Aurelius described, a battle fought and won where the narcissist cannot even see the war taking place. The 5th method moves outward from the mind into action, addressing a behavior so many people mistake for kindness, when the Stoics would call it something closer to self-betrayal. Chapter 5. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly proving your goodness to someone who has already decided to doubt it. Many people caught in a relationship with a narcissist, whether romantic, familial, or professional, fall into a pattern the Stoics would recognize immediately as a form of self-betrayal, disguised as virtue. They keep giving, keep accommodating, keep softening their own needs, believing that enough kindness will eventually earn fair treatment in return. Seneca warned against precisely this kind of giving in his writings on benefits, observing that a gift offered to someone who will only exploit it is not virtue, it is waste. This 5th method is the discipline of withdrawing unearned access, and it is the most actionable of everything taught so far. The Stoics distinguished sharply between virtue and submission. Virtue means acting with integrity regardless of how others behave. Submission means abandoning your own boundaries because you fear the conflict that enforcing them might cause. A narcissist depends entirely on your confusion between. They will often frame your boundaries as cruelty and your accommodation as the only acceptable form of love, training you to believe that withdrawing your access to yourself is a moral failure rather than a moral necessity. Marcus Aurelius held supreme power over the Roman Empire and yet refused to grant unlimited access to his time, his decisions, or his inner state, even to those closest to him. He understood that access is not owed simply because someone demands it. A narcissist often behaves as though your presence, your patience, your forgiveness, and your second chances are permanent entitlements rather than gifts you choose to extend. The 5th method requires you to mentally and practically reclaim ownership of those gifts, deciding deliberately who continues to receive them and under what conditions. This does not require dramatic confrontation. It does not require a speech, an ultimatum, or a public severing of ties, although in some cases those may eventually become necessary. It begins much smaller, in the quiet decision to stop over-explaining your boundaries to someone who only uses your explanations as new entry points for argument. It begins in choosing not to immediately respond to provocation, not because you are afraid, but because you have decided your time no longer belongs automatically to whoever demands it. It begins in noticing the difference between a request made with respect and a demand disguised as one, and responding to each accordingly. Seneca lived under the constant threat of an emperor who could, on a whim, end his life, and even within that danger, he maintained an internal sovereignty that no external power could fully strip from him. If a man facing literal execution could preserve ownership over his own dignity, you, facing nothing more lethal than another person's disapproval, can certainly learn to withhold the unearned access a narcissist has come to expect as their right. This is the moment where most people believe the work is finished, where the 4 methods already covered feel like enough. But there is a 6th principle, deeper than boundaries and quieter than detachment, the one Marcus Aurelius considered the true foundation beneath everything else you have learned tonight. Chapter 6. Before any boundary can hold, before any detachment can last, there must exist a foundation strong enough to support it. And Marcus Aurelius spent his entire life building that foundation through a practice he called returning to one's own ruling faculty. In simpler terms, this is the discipline of self-possession, the recognition that your worth was never something a narcissist had the authority to determine in the first place, no matter how convincingly they performed that authority. This is where most people, even after learning the previous 5 methods, still find themselves vulnerable, because techniques alone cannot protect a person whose sense of identity has quietly become dependent on another person's approval. A narcissist is remarkably skilled at positioning themselves as the judge of your value, your intelligence, your attractiveness, your competence, until you begin consulting their opinion before consulting your own. Marcus Aurelius warned against precisely this trap, writing that it is a kind of slavery to allow your mind to be tugged in different directions by another person's judgments, especially when that person has shown no real wisdom in their judgments at all. Ask yourself honestly whether the narcissist in your life has demonstrated wisdom, integrity, or genuine insight in other areas. Often the answer is no. Often this is a person whose own life shows clear patterns of instability, broken relationships, or unresolved cruelty, and yet somehow their opinion of you has been granted disproportionate authority inside your own mind. Marcus Aurelius would find this absurd. Why would a man governing his own soul outsource its valuation to someone who cannot govern theirs? The discipline of self-possession requires you to return, again and again, to a single internal question whenever a narcissist's words begin to take root. Whose judgment am I currently operating under, theirs or my own? This question alone interrupts the automatic process where their criticism becomes your self-concept. It forces a separation between what they said and what you, after careful and honest reflection, actually believe to be true about yourself. Sometimes their criticism contains a grain of truth worth examining. Often it contains none at all, manufactured purely to destabilize you. The discipline is not refusing all feedback. The discipline is refusing to let feedback bypass your own reasoning and install itself directly as fact. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he alone was responsible for the health of his own mind, that no external force, however persistent, however cleverly disguised as concern or love, could occupy the throne of his judgment without his permission. This is perhaps the most radical claim within all of Stoic philosophy applied to narcissistic abuse. Permission. Every method discussed so far depends on this single, quiet truth, that the narcissist's power was never inherent to them. It was loaned to them piece by piece through your permission, often given unconsciously, often given out of love, fear, or hope. Reclaiming that permission is not an act of anger toward them. It is an act of restoration toward yourself, the slow and deliberate process of returning the throne to its rightful occupant, which was always you, even during the years it felt occupied by someone else entirely. The 7th principle now turns toward something practical, a daily exercise the Stoics actually performed, one you can begin using tonight, the very next time the narcissist in your life attempts to reclaim the throne you have just reclaimed. Chapter 7. Marcus Aurelius performed a nightly ritual that historians believe shaped much of what eventually became his private writings, the collection now known as Meditations. Before sleep, he would review the events of his day, examining his own reactions with the detached curiosity of a teacher grading a student's work, asking where he had acted with wisdom and where he had allowed himself to be governed by impulse instead. This seventh method adapts that ancient ritual into a specific defense against narcissistic manipulation, a nightly practice that prevents their influence from accumulating unnoticed in your mind. The danger of narcissistic relationships rarely lives in a single dramatic event. It lives in accumulation, in the slow erosion that happens when manipulation occurs daily, in small enough doses that no single incident feels significant enough to address. Yet the combined weight gradually reshapes your entire sense of reality. This is sometimes called gaslighting in modern language, but the Stoics would recognize it simply as a failure to examine the day honestly, before allowing it to settle into memory unchallenged. The practice itself requires only a few quiet minutes, ideally at the close of each day. You ask yourself 3 questions modeled directly on the journaling method Marcus Aurelius used, though adapted specifically for this purpose. First, what did the narcissist actually say or do today? Stripped of interpretation, exactly as a neutral witness would describe it. Second, what story did I begin constructing around that event? And is that story something they planted? Or something I generated from old wounds that have nothing to do with this specific moment? Third, what is true about my own character and worth, independent of anything they said or implied today? This practice matters because narcissists rely heavily on the fact that their targets rarely pause to separate the actual event from the emotional residue it leaves behind. Without this nightly examination, residue accumulates day after day, until a person can no longer remember what they believed about themselves before the relationship began. The nightly review interrupts that accumulation. It forces a kind of mental accounting, ensuring that whatever was true about you this morning remains true tonight, regardless of what was said in between. Seneca practiced something remarkably similar, writing that he examined his entire day each night, asking what bad habit he had cured, what fault he had checked, in what respect he had improved. Applied here, the question becomes slightly different, but equally powerful. In what respect did I protect my own mind today? And in what respect did I hand over territory I will need to reclaim tomorrow? This is not self-criticism. It is self-stewardship, the quiet management of an inner life too valuable to leave unexamined. Over weeks and months, this nightly practice produces something the narcissist cannot interrupt or manipulate, because it happens in complete privacy, away from any audience they could perform for. You begin to notice their patterns with increasing clarity, no longer surprised by behavior you have now documented, even if only in memory, dozens of times before. You begin to trust your own perception again, rebuilding the very foundation a narcissist works tirelessly to erode. The eighth method shifts attention to something the Stoics valued perhaps above all virtues when facing those who wished them harm, a quality so countercultural in how we typically discuss difficult people that many will resist it. Chapter 8. The word that will likely cause resistance in this chapter is forgiveness, and it deserves careful explanation before the resistance solidifies into rejection, because Stoic forgiveness bears almost no resemblance to the version popular culture has diluted into excusing harmful behavior or pretending wounds never happened. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about how to relate to those who wrong us, and his conclusion was neither naive nor weak. He believed that hatred toward another person, however justified it may feel, ultimately functions as a poison the hater drinks, while waiting for the other person to suffer. This eighth method is the discipline of philosophical forgiveness, which the Stoics approached not as a gift given to the narcissist, but as a release performed entirely for your own benefit. Marcus Aurelius reasoned that people who behave badly typically do so out of ignorance about what is truly good, mistaking power, control, or admiration for the genuine goods that actually constitute a worthwhile life. He wrote that we should not be surprised when a fig tree produces figs, and we should not be surprised when a person who values manipulation over integrity behaves according to that flawed value system. This does not excuse the behavior. It simply removes your surprise and eventually your rage. Notice carefully what this method does not require. It does not require reconciliation. It does not require trusting the narcissist again, granting them renewed access, or pretending their actions caused no damage. Seneca was explicit that forgiveness without continued caution is simply an invitation for further harm, and the Stoics never confused emotional release with practical naivety. You can release your hatred towards someone while simultaneously maintaining every boundary discussed in the previous methods. These are not contradictory positions. They are, in fact, deeply complementary, because hatred itself often becomes the very thing that keeps you mentally tethered to someone you are trying to separate from in every other respect. Consider what hatred actually requires of you. It requires continued attention. It requires mental energy spent constructing scenarios of justice, imagining their downfall, replaying their cruelty in search of new angles of anger. This is, ironically, another form of the attention theft discussed earlier. Except now you are the one initiating the theft against yourself, using hatred as the vehicle. The narcissist, who may have moved on entirely, unaffected by your resentment, remains comfortably outside the prison you have built, while you serve the sentence alone. Epictetus offered a particularly sharp formulation of this idea, teaching that when someone wrongs you, the wrongdoer harms themselves more deeply than they harm you, because they have corrupted their own character, the only possession truly theirs to ruin. Your character, your integrity, your inner peace remain entirely your own, untouched by their actions unless you choose to let resentment corrode them on their behalf. This reframing does not happen instantly. It is a discipline practiced repeatedly, often imperfectly, until the grip of resentment gradually loosens its hold. Philosophical forgiveness, then, is not extended because the narcissist deserves it. It is extended because you deserve the freedom it produces, the freedom to think about something other than them, to build a life no longer organized around their cruelty. Even in memory, the ninth method addresses what happens after release, the question of how a person rebuilds identity once they are no longer defined, even silently, by their relationship to someone who tried to diminish them. Chapter 9. After release comes reconstruction, and this is the stage many people overlook entirely. Assuming that once they have separated from a narcissist's influence, whether physically, mentally, or both, the work is complete. The Stoics understood this assumption to be incomplete, because identity does not automatically refill the space that manipulation once occupied. Without deliberate reconstruction, that space often remains hollow, vulnerable to being filled again by the next person who learns to exploit it the same way. This ninth method is the discipline of returning to your own nature, what Marcus Aurelius described as living according to the principles that actually belong to you, rather than the distorted reflection a narcissist spent months or years convincing you was accurate. Narcissistic relationships frequently function like a hall of mirrors, where the version of yourself reflected back is intentionally warped, sometimes flattering in ways designed to manipulate, sometimes cruel in ways designed to diminish, but rarely, if ever, accurate. The discipline now is stepping fully outside that hall and asking a question the Stoics considered foundational to a well-lived life. Who was I before their voice became louder than my own? And who do I actually wish to become now that their voice no longer governs the answer? Marcus Aurelius believed every person carried within them a kind of inner compass oriented toward reason, integrity, and contribution, what he called living in accordance with nature. A narcissist's influence does not destroy this compass, but it does bury it under layers of self-doubt, hypervigilance, and exhausting emotional management that leave little energy for genuine self-examination. The work of reconstruction involves deliberately excavating that compass again, often through small, almost mundane practices, returning to interests abandoned during the relationship, rebuilding friendships that were slowly isolated away, making decisions based on your own values rather than anticipating someone else's reaction. Seneca wrote to Lucilius about the importance of choosing one's models carefully, suggesting that we select a person of strong character and keep them present in our minds as a kind of internal witness to our actions. In the context of recovering from narcissistic influence, this method becomes particularly powerful. Rather than orienting your decisions around what would please or provoke the narcissist, you begin orienting them around what a person you deeply admire, someone embodying genuine wisdom and integrity, would consider a life well lived. This shift moves your internal compass away from reactive positioning against someone else's dysfunction and toward proactive alignment with your own chosen values. Reconstruction also requires patience that modern culture rarely grants itself. There is often pressure to feel completely healed quickly, to perform recovery for an audience the same way the narcissist once demanded performance for them. The Stoics rejected this urgency. Epictetus taught that progress is gradual, that a person does not become wise in a single day, and the same patience applies to rebuilding an identity that was systematically eroded over months or years. Some days will feel like genuine freedom. Other days, old patterns of self-doubt will resurface unexpectedly, triggered by something as small as a tone of voice resembling theirs. This is not failure. This is the natural, non-linear shape of authentic reconstruction. What emerges from this process, when given sufficient time and deliberate attention, is not simply a person who survived a narcissist, but a person whose character has been tested, examined, and consciously rebuilt according to their own genuine values, often resulting in a strength and self-knowledge that would never have been forged without the trial itself. The 10th and final method brings together everything taught tonight into a single unified practice, the one Marcus Aurelius considered the ultimate expression of Stoic mastery, the method that makes a narcissist's power not just diminished, but entirely irrelevant. Chapter 10. Everything taught tonight converges into a single principle, the one Marcus Aurelius placed above all others, the discipline he considered the final mark of a person who has truly mastered themselves. He called it amor fati, the love of one's fate, and applied to the specific suffering caused by a narcissist, it becomes the most complete form of victory available to anyone who has endured manipulation, betrayal, or control at the hands of someone who never deserved that much influence over their life. Amor fati does not mean approving of what the narcissist did. It does not mean pretending the damage was good, or that cruelty should be welcomed as a gift. Marcus Aurelius meant something far more precise. He meant accepting that this event, this relationship, this specific suffering, became part of the material from which your character was forged, and rather than wishing it had never happened, a Stoic learns to ask what was built because it did. This is not resignation. It is the final refusal to let the narcissist's actions remain, even in your own mind. A tragedy with no redemptive value, when you alone hold the power to determine what that suffering ultimately produced in you. Consider everything the previous 9 methods required you to build. The discipline of separating events from interpretation, the refusal to explain yourself to someone uninterested in truth, the premeditation that stripped their behavior of its power to shock you, the fortress guarding your attention as sacred territory, the withdrawal of access that was never earned, the return to self-possession after years of outsourced judgment, the nightly examination protecting your perception from erosion, the philosophical forgiveness that freed you, not them, the patient reconstruction of an identity finally your own again. None of these disciplines would exist within you, sharpened and proven, without the very trial that forced you to develop them. This is what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. The narcissist believed they were diminishing you. In reality, faced with the full weight of Stoic discipline, they became the forge. Every method you now carry, every piece of psychological armor you have quietly built throughout this video, exists because someone tried to break you and instead taught you, against their own intention, exactly how unbreakable you were capable of becoming. This is the final transformation, the one the narcissist senses but can never name, the one that renders their entire strategy obsolete. They built their power on your reactions, your explanations, your hope for their change, your hatred, your hollowed identity waiting to be filled by their definition of you. One by one, you have reclaimed every piece of that foundation. What remains, finally, is a person no longer fighting the narcissist at all, because there is nothing left in you for them to fight against. Not anger to provoke, not guilt to exploit, not hope to manipulate, not identity to distort, only a quiet, complete indifference. The very thing they feared most from the beginning, now fully and permanently your own. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, and still considered the conquest of his own mind his greatest achievement. You may never command armies or wear a crown, but tonight you leave with something he valued above both. A mind no longer for sale to anyone who never deserved to own it.